Well, I think what mindfulness does is it gets us into, what Dan Siegel or Tina Bryson might call the window of tolerance, right? And I think what else it does is it builds almost neurologically a shortcut to that window of tolerance. And it starts to grow and push open that window of tolerance.
There are skills and strategies that all of us can use to help reduce our stress and manage anxiety. But sometimes some of them get a bit oversold. How can we break down the concepts of mindfulness to help kids, teens, and ourselves overcome that skepticism about it? And how does this all tie in with self-compassion? Our guest today, Dr. Christopher Willard, is a psychologist, Harvard professor, and author of many books for all ages about managing stress and implementing mindful practices. That's straight ahead on episode 175. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Before we get to our conversation with Chris, I wanted to mention something. If you're a mental health clinician and are looking for continuing education related specifically to neurodiversity affirming practices, there's an awesome opportunity coming up this month for you to attend. I'll be conducting a 2-hour live interactive training on assessing and treating suicidality and self-injury in neurodivergent clients. This will be on Tuesday, June 20th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern. If you're in St. Louis, you can attend in person, but if you aren't local, you can still join virtually and be a part of this interactive training. We'll provide verification of attendance for those of you who need continuing education hours. And don't worry, if you can't attend live, we will also be producing this course as a self-study option on neurodiversity.university. There's just something that's so powerful and unique about having the opportunity to collaborate and learn with like-minded clinicians. This live event is one that you won't want to miss. Registration links for both the in-person event and the virtual option are in the show notes. Okay, Dr. Chris Willard is along in a minute.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
That kind of liberal education model where you get to learn a little bit about everything and where you get to have freedom to choose the things that are of interest to you, neurodiverse people, that's where they would thrive. And that's exactly how our education system used to be, right? Like the highest thing was that you were a Renaissance man, let's say, someone who does dabble in everything a little bit, but we've moved so far away from that now. We feel like narrowing everything down is doing a service. It's sort of helping people prepare. The truth is that even after college, in order for neurodiverse people to feel successful and functional, they can't be in environments where it's too narrow because that just doesn't match their thinking.
That's episode 170. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Our guest today is Dr. Chris Willard. Chris is a clinical psychologist, professor at Harvard Medical School, and author of several books, both for children and adults, including Alphabreaths 2. Chris, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
I find it really interesting that anxiety is one of those things that looks so different in so many different people. I've met adults who are diagnosed with anxiety and didn't even realize that that was exactly what they were dealing with for years. They just thought it was how everybody always felt. And kids, they often don't have the language to express exactly how they're feeling, so it can be even harder to recognize. I'm curious if you can elaborate on some of the ways that anxiety might show up in kids and teens, especially how we view it from an adult perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually really love this question because I think as clinicians, we get so caught up in jargon. And a few years ago, I was working on writing something, and I'm kind of reworking it again now. It really is like, what does the DSM say anxiety is? What does a kid say anxiety is? Each of the symptoms, and what might an adult see? And I think this is so important. I mean, or some of these other symptoms that we read. It's like, what does anhedonia mean to anybody besides a clinician, right?
Right.
But to a kid, it's like, you know what, I really like my video games aren't fun anymore. This isn't, like I'm not having fun with friends. Or an adult might be like, they're not doing these things that they used to love in a way that's also not developmentally appropriate. I guess anhedonia is actually more of a depression symptom than anxiety symptom, but
yeah, but that's okay.
But I think, we see all this anxiety with kids too. And I think it's looking at, particularly with kids, somaticizing symptoms and talking about stomach aches and things like that. Kind of their brains feeling like they're shutting down, brain freeze, brain fart, some of those words that kids use that are developmentally appropriate that describe, cognitive impacts of anxiety. So I think it's really important that we really look at, what are the ways that anxiety manifests, and all kinds of mental health issues are manifesting, because there are just so many right now, in particular, as you said, and anxiety being particularly through the roof with kids. What are the ways they're avoiding things, like really obviously avoiding things, or subtly just sort of realizing my own son was like getting up, which was totally great during the commercial breaks when we were watching a show, which is like, yeah, you should, but realizing actually it was less about the boredom, but he was really afraid that he was going to see something scary on the commercials. And so then we were able to have a conversation about that, and I'm fine with him skipping the commercials for all kinds of reasons, but, really kind of digging in on what is the avoidance about in terms of particular things. So all these kinds of questions, I think, are so important.
Yeah. And I think as adults, even as a clinician, you have to check yourself and make sure that you're not making assumptions about what those things are. Mm-hmm. But it's also hard to encourage kids to talk about them because they don't automatically do that. Or even if you ask the question, they might not know exactly what you're asking.
Right.
So having that space to do that is kind of a really important factor to help elicit that and help them verbalize some of those things.
Right. And what does anxiety look like? We're hopefully past the pandemic, as you and I are speaking right now. But what does it look like in a time that everyone is isolating? And even as we're not as isolated, everyone's in the habit of isolating.
Right.
So that we all have some, we've all definitely not gotten the exposure therapy to being social, to putting ourselves out there, to doing these other things, and then teasing out what's habit based on the pandemic, what's, anxiety based on a child, what's just other lack of, kind of social pragmatics that a kid might have, so they feel underskilled, or simply are not that interested in these other kids because they don't share common, so I think all these questions are so important to look more subtly at what's the behavior, and then let's look at what are the 5 things that could be under it. It could be anxiety, it could be trauma, it could be depression, it could be exhaustion, it could be they didn't eat that day, it could be neuroatypicality in some way, and a lack of skills. So I think it's also really important to look at that too.
Yeah.
And when we get curious about kids and ask them questions with authentic curiosity, we can start to tease out, is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it underskilled? Is it all of them? Mm-hmm. And then where can we give them that support that they need?
Yeah, I think the key word that you used just then was that being curious.
Yeah.
And just kind of trying to non-judgmentally, just kind of wondering, what's going on. And one of the things that I've had to always work on and learn is definitely not rapid firing multiple choice options at my own children. Like, I'm like, well, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this?
A, B, and C.
Yes. And they'll go, yes, that's what it is. But if you give them the space to kind of think about it a little bit, they might come up with something totally different that you weren't even expecting.
Right. And curiosity, Emily, like I don't know if you're familiar with Jed Brewer's work. He does anxiety work.
Yeah.
I was listening to him speak recently. He's also a mindfulness guy. And he was talking about curiosity as actually being physiologically an antidote to anxiety.
Wow.
So when we actually activate curiosity in our brains or in a child's brain, it shuts down the anxiety part of the brain, like that sends the blood into the prefrontal cortex and out of the limbic system in a way that actually starts to quiet down anxiety. So I love that we're talking about curiosity here too on so many levels when we think about kids, but yeah.
So not only for the adult to be curious about what's going on within the inner world of the child, but to help the child be curious themselves about what's happening.
Right. And about their own experience and And as you said, and I know, we're going to be talking about mindfulness, but you described very well sort of how do we be non-judgmental? How do we be open? I love that you're even just, starting to bring that in and teaching our kids to do that as well about their own experience.
Yeah.
Start to just get curious about it.
Yeah.
And that really does start to shift things. It doesn't mean that we like them, but it means, something is happening, and it actually does change what's happening physiologically out of the anxiety state.
Well, and speaking of mindfulness, I know that there are a lot of different strategies that can help with overcoming stress and anxiety. So a lot of people are familiar with like CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy strategies of shifting thoughts to reframe anxiety, which, I mean, personally, sometimes I think they're oversold a little bit, but
just a little.
But you obviously really have some expertise when it comes to mindfulness. So why don't we start off, if you just want to share a little bit more about what mindfulness is and perhaps dispel any misconceptions that people might have about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are so many ways to define mindfulness. It's a little overwhelming, and there's sort of like the watered down versions, and there's the more clinical versions. And, I kind of include a lot of, when I talk about mindfulness, I do define it in my way, but I also do think there's a lot of mindfulness adjacent, positive psychology, self-regulation, breath work, that maybe, depending on where we want to kind of draw the parameters around it. But to me, in some ways, it's about knowing what we're doing as we're doing it. So trying to act with intentionality. Another way I think of it actually is, how do we cultivate curiosity about our experience? Or another kind of more clinical definition might be something like paying attention to the here and now with acceptance and non-judgment, and trying to do that on purpose. I know that those are all kind of loaded, abstract. How do we even, as adults, kind of think about this? But to me, I think really just like, how do we bring a little bit more deliberate intentionality to breathing, to walking, to finding those pauses, those spaces where we can reset, re-regulate our nervous system a little bit so that we can choose our response rather than just react to a situation that's overstimulating or threatening or activates emotions, and again, not just negative emotions, but overwhelms us with joy or with silliness, as well as overwhelms us with anger or fight or flight or something like that. So we can just be more aware of our emotions and make I guess, as I say to my kids, make better choices. Well, it sounds so judgmental when I say it sometimes.
Oh, I know. Well, so let's talk a little bit more about the nervous system component there, because I think especially a lot of, not necessarily only, but a lot of neurodivergent kids and perhaps adults might be kind of skeptical about utilizing some of these strategies. So it really helps them to understand the why and the how.
Yeah.
So why does mindfulness work? Like, what's happening in the body that actually helps to reduce that stress and anxiety?
Yeah, well, I think what mindfulness does is it gets us into, what Dan Siegel or Tina Bryson might call the window of tolerance, right? And I think what else it does is it builds almost neurologically a shortcut to that window of tolerance, and it starts to grow and push open that window of tolerance. And by window of tolerance, I mean the space in which our physiology, our nervous system is well regulated, and we're responding rather than just reacting. The space that's between what we might call hyper-aroused or fight or flight, and the space that we might call hypo-aroused and more kind of trauma language, and call that kind of freeze and faint or freeze and F it, or teenagers have a different F word besides you forget it. But kind of in that in-between space where we can really be our best, right? And so what mindfulness does is it actually really does physiologically, our heart rate variability starts to shift to become more even. Our breath rate becomes regular and even in the body. Digestive system is working, things like that. Immune system. In the brain, what's happening is that really our whole brain is activated rather than most of the blood being in the amygdala, the limbic system, that kind of, if I'm being a little bit wonky here, the brain's alarm system, basically. So we're not in that. The blood is actually in the prefrontal cortex, which we hear a lot about, where we make our decisions and we manage our impulses and we think critically and in, complex ways. It's also in our insular cortices, where we have a little bit more of our social reasoning, our empathy, our perspective taking of other people. So that actually what we're seeing then is when we practice mindfulness or we do other things that are self-regulation, we're sending blood to these parts of the brain where we're really at our best for learning and thinking in school, managing our behavior, and actually having more clear understanding of other people and other people's motivations. So it's really exciting then to then think about, with kids, a lot of times, this is sort of like hack your brain, hack your nervous system, like turn on the social the social part of your brain and exercise it when you want that. And then go back to fight or flight when it's useful to be in fight or flight. Turn on the learning, the impulse control, the deep thinking part of your brain, and then turn it off if you do need to go into kind of, freeze and faint kind of mode when you're really tired or worn out by the end of the day. So I don't always talk about mindfulness as like be mindful all the time. That'd be great, but it's like how do you get into these different sorts of physiological states, really, in these different kinds of brain states through breath work or attention awareness or sensory practices or things like that I think can be movement, as well as all the other great self-soothing strategies that are out there besides just mindfulness ones.
Yeah. A lot of times when I'm working with clients, if they are at all perfectionistic, a lot of times they will push back against mindfulness ideas because they feel like if they can't do it perfectly the first time, or if they can't, be successful, then it doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for them. And I was reading something recently, or I saw something online, I don't remember, but it was talking about how literally the whole point of many mindfulness exercises is to fail. Because when you recognize that you're failing, that's when you're mindful. You're like, oh, wait, I was focusing on that thing. Now I'm not focusing anymore. I've got to pull it back.
Yeah. I love it. And that's teaching then frustration tolerance. It's teaching that you're aware. It's like, I was bored. Well, you're aware that you're bored. Like before when you were bored, you just sort of pinching your sister. Now when you're bored, you notice that you're bored. How did you know that you were bored? I felt it in my body. I felt my mind. So it's even can like lead to just these sort of fun conversations with kids too about how it's hard. Yeah.
So are there certain techniques that you find really useful at various ages? Like I know you've written some children's books that kind of introduce some concepts. What are some things that can be used like with really young kids, and how might those strategies really change as they mature?
I love this question because this is how I've really had to think about this as someone who started out practicing mindfulness as a grown up. Then like how do I adapt this for kids? I think with the littler kids, what I often start with, my own kids, my son was 3 or 4. Just like simple breathing practices, breathe in like you're smelling the hot chocolate, blow out like you're cooling it off. Like even a 2 or 3-year-old actually knows how to breathe in a regulated way like they're smelling and blow out like they're cooling off. And imagine even you're holding a cup of soup or hot chocolate or something like that. And then over time, I watched my son grow up. He doesn't, flap his wings with a butterfly breath or, hold up his hand with the hot chocolate breath, but it's the hands fall away, the movement falls away. And I think of that as being like taking the training wheels off or taking the scaffolding off, as Lev Vygotsky might say. So now he can just imagine it in his mind, the hot chocolate or something. And then another year or two, even that visualization can fade. He's learned how to regulate his breath. And we know that if you regulate your breath, you're regulating your body. That's regulating your nervous system. You're now regulating your brain and your impulses and your emotions and your focus and things like this. So the breathing can start in these really fun kind of playful ways that then, by the time they're in middle school, ideally they've regulated their breath, or maybe they do counting, breathe in for 7, breathe out to 11, something like that, instead of like, I'm going to do a rainbow breath with my arms, which is like, yeah, what middle schooler is going to do that, right? So that's part of it. And then I think, to kind of name check Vygotsky again, I remember reading this study about him trying to get a group of 8-year-olds to stand still. And, this went about as well as you expected, right? He gets out his stopwatch. Okay, stand still, right? Of course, they're running around all over the place after a couple minutes. And so he calls them back in. He says, all right, this time stand still, but imagine you're the guard at a factory, right? This, he lived in Soviet Russia, now he might say, like, imagine you're a knight guarding a castle or something. And of course, when you tap into play and imagination and role-playing in competition, what's happening now is the kids ended up standing still for 15, 18 minutes, something like that. So that we use the imagination as the anchor, which is maybe more fun than using focus on your breath for 18 minutes, right? It's like, oh no, I'm going to be a ninja for 18 minutes. Or I think about when I was a kid, I never heard the word mindfulness, but I remember going to this camp when I was like 8 years old, like my son is now. He actually goes to the same nature camp, and we'd go into the woods and they'd say, we're going to walk like ninjas in the woods, walk as silently as you can. And that's way more fun than saying, everyone shut up and walk mindfully, right?
Right.
Or we're gonna listen like a deer, and again, maybe the counselors wanted to get us to shut up. Like as a parent, I know they probably were, right? But it really did stick with me that when I learned mindful walking in my 20s, I was like, oh, if I'm focused on walking like a ninja, I'm focused on the texture of the ground. I'm focused on the bottom of my feet. I'm not thinking about the past. I'm not thinking about the future. These are the training wheels for mindfulness. So it's thinking kind of developmentally in these ways for how do we teach? What's the scaffolding a kid might need? How do we adapt? Howard Gardner actually just finished his book about higher ed, but some kids need to learn through movement, others through stillness, some through music, some through imagery. Other kids, the imagery thing doesn't work for them. So we need to adapt to what their particular learning style, learning needs might be, their learning preferences might be, and not come at them with a one-size-fits-all either, I think is also so key.
Yeah, I think that's important because I know especially, for a lot of our audience who are either educating or supporting neurodivergent kids, I think especially like that visualization can be really tricky for some of those kids. Mm-hmm. Or I know another thing that I've run into sometimes with some of my clients is that they really feel uncomfortable closing their eyes when they're doing any sort of mindfulness activities. So we have to kind of work around that a little bit. And it's like, I was using some prompts out of a book or whatever, and I was just really reading the instructions. And so then I had to step back and go, well, what difference does it make if they close their eyes or not? Like whatever works for them, right, there's no real wrong way to do that, but helping them be more aware of it was kind of the key.
Exactly. And I think especially, I know this podcast and your work is so much around neurodivergent kids, more than ever, I think, how do we meet their learning preferences and needs rather than expecting them? It's like one thing we've hopefully learned from working and learning more about neurodiversity is, what can we adults do to adapt? And how do we also maintain our own mindfulness so that we're not losing it on them when we get frustrated, when they're not doing it the way we want, perfectly still or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then it's finding the metaphors that resonate with the different kids based on their experiences or their interests and as you said, also, I've really been, had the humility to learn how much, for me, visualizations, imagine you're laying by a stream and putting your thoughts in the stream. I love those kinds of practices, but a lot of people just are like, yeah, I can't do that. And and so it was like, at first I was like, well, we'll keep trying. It's like, well, that's not going to help. It's like, oh no, I need to adapt now and come up with different kinds of practices or adapt different kinds of practices to help people whose brains don't quite work that way. And so, we can take as adults, and again, I'm sure your listeners are thinking about this, but we could take that as a challenge and something fun. How do I adapt whatever it is for this kind of brain that's sitting in front of me that's really precious and exceptional, but, doesn't work how mine does. And that can be a creative challenge for us, or work with the kid to help them find what works for them rather than saying, I'm going to think of something and experiment on you, but how can we work together to help you find something that you find regulating, that also you find fun and will do. It's like mindfulness is good, as we all know, but it's like, how do we make it fun? They're not going to do it unless it's either fun or useful, right? Yeah. And even as you said, just like, what's the posture? Why worry about that too much? Eyes open or closed? Why worry about that too much? I think is also just so important.
Yeah. I think another important facet of mindfulness is related to the practice of having self-compassion.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about why self-compassion is so integral to our well-being in general.
Yeah. To me, self-compassion is, it's giving ourselves what we need in a moment of pain. I think as adults who work with or parent or live with, challenging kids who are different from us, whose brains are different from us, and every child's brain is different from ours, but I know we're talking about more significant differences here on your podcast. I think, we lose our tempers. All of us lose our tempers with our kids. And how do we forgive ourselves so that we can, keep moving forward and also model self-forgiveness, model humility. And so I think giving ourselves these little moments of, just remembering that this is hard, taking the time to just place a hand on our heart. This is tough. There's not no kids come with an instruction manual. 2E kids absolutely do not, even though they come with wonderful podcasts like yours sometimes. But like, knowing that we're not alone, knowing that there are other parents out there who are struggling, how would we'd be kind to our friends who we are in the support groups or the online groups that are supporting us through this journey, and our therapists. Like, why can't we be our own therapist? Why can't we be our own parent? Why can't we? I was talking with a friend this morning about how we all have a critical voice in our heads, and how do we shift that from, we have such an authoritarian voice with ourselves so often. How do we shift that to the authoritative voice to ourselves? And that to me is what self-compassion is about, is not having to believe everything that critical voice says, and having to and learning how to turn up the volume on a more compassionate voice, so that we don't get so burned out, I think.
Yeah. And I think the connection there that I'm seeing is you have to be able to be mindful in order to recognize when that voice is taking over.
Right.
In order to be aware of what's happening and then be able to take the step back, whether that means that you recognize the voice that's in your head, or you recognize the physical sensation that you're experiencing in your body as, something else, and then taking the moment to say, what do I need, or what's going to help me with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, mindfulness, as Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, they sort of, the way they describe self-compassion, mindfulness is, knowing what's happening, in the moment, and self-compassion is more giving ourselves what we need in the moment. But it only begins through noticing what we need and noticing the suffering that we're having in a particular moment, that then allows us to give ourselves what we really need in that moment, that soothing that's actually soothing, that firm but gentle but loving voice that says, hey, you got this. This is hard, but you got this, I think is so helpful. And I think so helpful to model for our kids who feel different, who are different. I read this fun study recently also about, I think it was teachers, but it was like having teachers model making a mistake and then healthy self-talk. Like, they deliberately spell something wrong on the board and then say, whoops, that's why pencils have erasers, or, whatever, something kind of corny like that. But what they found was actually the teachers that did that in this experiment, the kids were then like raising their hands more and taking more risks, even when they didn't know the answer, because they saw that it was safe to make a mistake. And they started to internalize, how does the teacher speak to themselves when they make it? And I think we parents, it's so important that we do this too. I'm sure the research would back that up. So I think this is important to deliberately, even out loud, model a more self-compassionate tone with ourselves to our kids. Just as I try to also out loud and ostentatiously model mindfulness for my kids. It's like we're playing a heated game of backgammon, me and my son, and I'm like, I just need a couple breaths. I need to lean back. Okay, now I can see the board more clearly, right? And my daughter, who's even younger, it's like, if I breathe before I roll the dice, I'm going to get a better roll. It's like, I don't know, Dad. But like, I think, and now I watch my son, we're playing backgammon, it gets exciting, and he wants to look like a grown-up. So he like leans back and does a breath and sort of strokes his chin and then like makes his move with the checkers on the board. So it's, and likewise with self-compassion, I think our kids, they're so harsh on themselves when society has told them there's something wrong with them, or 2E kids when they're being told, you're so smart, but also why aren't you doing that? Like, it's such a horribly mixed message, and it's so confusing for kids. So having that self-compassion is so important for them, and so important for us caregivers too.
I think adults can fall into this trap as well, but especially kids, for whatever reason, think adults have it all figured out. I think adults sometimes think that everyone else has it all figured out and that they're the only one who doesn't know.
Yeah, we all do.
But I think also it's been interesting, I think, for me, even as a clinician, when I went through my program of study, we talked a lot about what's appropriate self-disclosure. How much should we share? How much? And you know what? I'm always and like going, yep, I did that too, or I messed up, because it normalizes it. It makes it okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, that has been a helpful lesson. I do feel like for starting clinicians, better to start with tighter boundaries. My mom was a therapist. She was a psychologist also. And she was like, start with tight boundaries and then figure out how you loosen them up. And I do feel like that's good advice.
Fair.
But it is so humanizing to be like, Yeah, as a parent, of course I've yelled at my kids. Like, I get the most mileage these days. My favorite story is my son whacking my daughter over the head with the mindfulness book that my wife and I wrote together. I mean, it's like, but it's and we don't want to be like, oh, I'm perfectly an imperfect parent either, because that's sort of its own trope, I feel like, on social media these days. But I think, especially if it's something so universal, of like parenting, it's like, yeah, parenting is freaking hard.
Yeah.
And parenting, challenging kids is hard, or kids that are neurodivergent is really hard. So it's yeah, I think that self-disclosure is really important for people to feel that, again, in both compassion and self-compassion, we talk about common humanity, but people to not just be seen, but to feel felt, I think is really important. And I think that's a gift that we can share when we self-disclose in skillful ways with people about some of our own imperfections and our successes too, of course.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I am so appreciative of our conversation today. As we wrap up our talk, I have one last question for you. If you were talking to a parent who was trying to figure out the best way to support their child who was dealing with anxiety, and maybe they're experiencing their own anxiety about the situation as well, what would you say to them? What is it that you would want them to hear?
A third of kids now have anxiety, so that they're not alone. And that I believe, and this is not to, and I don't want this to come across as blaming, but I believe that actually the best way to treat your kids' anxiety is to work on your own anxiety and your own regulation. Because especially with younger kids, the more well-regulated you are, the more you can co-regulate, the more your kid internalizes those skills. And with our son, to do some self-disclosure, he's got some anxiety. We've met with a clinician 5 or 6 times. He's never even met her. He probably won't. It's like, but he's getting better because, we're doing that work. And the longer I've been in the field, the more I believe us parents can be the biggest ones to make the difference. That's actually where your investment is probably best spent, time and financially, is on your own self-regulation strategies. And again, that's not to say parents are to blame. It's to say that you can actually do more of the work in some ways more efficiently on your own.
Yeah, I love that so much. I agree with that 100%. Dr. Chris Willard, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Developing strategies that are both approachable and practical is so important for neurodivergent brains. And sometimes really great ideas get dismissed because they become kind of watered down and buzzwordy. When I work with kids to try to build some of these skills, I'm always really cautious about how I frame things. I never overpromise about the benefits or insist that it'll work for everyone, because there's no quicker way to get a skeptic to refuse to try. We explore a variety of options to modify and attempt and experiment just to find out what might work, even just a little bit. And then we build from there. And once we have those basic building block skills, we can get just a little bit of momentum going to keep making that progress. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Dr. Christopher Willard. If you'd like to know more about him, check out the show notes or episode page. And don't forget about the in-person and virtual course for mental health professionals that Emily will be presenting June 20th. It's about assessing and treating suicidality and self-injury in neurodivergent clients. And it's great for CE credits as well. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us here, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.